was dependent on the state from which it came. It shook off that yoke, and crowned with eternal glory, became a Koom Posh." "Eternal glory! How long has the Koom Posh lasted?" "About 100 years." "The length of an An's life. A very young community. In much less than another 100 years your Koom Posh will be a Glek Nas." "Nay, the oldest states in the world I come from have such faith in its duration that they are all gradually shaping their institutions so as to melt into ours, and their most thoughtful politicians say that whether they like it or not, the inevitable tendency of these old states is towards Koom Poshery." "The old states?" "Yes, the old states." "With populations very small in proportion to the area of productive land?" "On the contrary, with populations very large in proportion to that area." "I see. Old states indeed. So old as to become drivelling if they don't pack off that surplus population as we do ours. Very old states. Very, very old. Pray, Tish, do you think it wise for very old men to try to turn head over heels as very young children do? And if you ask them why they attempted such antics, should you not laugh if they answered that by imitating very young children they could become very young children themselves? Ancient history abounds with instances of this sort a great many thousand years ago, and in every instance a very old state that played at Koom Posh soon tumbled into Glek Nas. Then, in horror of its own self, it cried out for a master, as an old man in his dotage cries out for a nurse. And after a succession of masters or nurses, more or less long, that very old state died out of history. A very old state attempting Koom Poshery is like a very old man who pulls down the house to which he has been accustomed, but he has so exhausted his vigor in pulling down that all he can do in the way of rebuilding is to run up a crazy hut, in which himself and his successors whine out, "How the wind blows! How the walls shake!" "My dear Taee, I make all excuse for your unenlightened prejudices, which every schoolboy educated in a Koom Posh could easily controvert, though he might not be so precociously learned in ancient history as you appear to be." "I learned! Not a bit of it. But would a schoolboy, educated in your Koom Posh, ask his great great grandfather or great great grandmother to stand on his or her head with the feet uppermost? And if the poor old folks hesitated, say, 'What do you fear? See how I do it?'" "Taee, I disdain to argue with a child of your age. I repeat, I make allowances for your want of that culture which a Koom Posh alone can bestow." "I, in my turn," answered Taee, with an air of suave but lofty good breeding which characterizes his race, "not only make allowances for you as not educated among the vril-ya, but I entreat you to vouchsafe me your pardon for the insufficient respect to the habits and opinions of so amiable a Tish." I ought before to have observed that I was commonly called Tish by my host and his family, as being a polite and indeed a pet name, literally signifying a small barbarian. The children apply it endearingly to the tame species of frog which they keep in their gardens. We had now reached the banks of a lake, and Taee here paused to point out to me the ravages made in the fields skirting it. "The enemy certainly lies within these waters," said Taee. "Observe what shoals of fish are crowded together at the margin." Even the great fishes with the small ones, who are their habitual prey and who generally shun them, all forget their instincts in the presence of a common destroyer. This reptile certainly must belong to the class of vril-ya, which are more devouring than any other, and are said to be among the few surviving species of the world's dreadest inhabitants before the Ana were created. The appetite of a krek is insatiable. It feeds alike upon vegetable and animal life. But for the swift footed creatures of the elk species it is too slow in its movements. Its favourite dainty is an awn when it can catch him unawares, and hence the Ana destroy it relentlessly whenever it enters their dominion. I have heard that when our forefathers first cleared this country, these monsters, and others like them, abounded, and vril being then undiscovered, many of our race were devoured. It was impossible to exterminate them wholly till that discovery which constitutes the power and sustains the civilization of our race. But after the uses of vril became familiar to us, all creatures inimical to us were soon annihilated. Still, once a year or so, one of these enormous creatures wanders from the unreclaimed and savage districts beyond, and within my memory one has seized upon a young Gy who was bathing in this very lake. Had she been on land and armed with her staff, it would not have dared even to show itself; for, like all savage creatures, the reptile has a marvellous instinct which warns it against the bearer of the vril wand. How they teach their young to avoid him, though seen for the first time, is one of those mysteries which you may ask Z to explain, for I cannot. The reptile in this instinct does but resemble our wild birds and animals, which will not come in reach of a man armed with a gun. When the electric wires were first put up, partridges struck against them in their flight, and fell down wounded. No younger generations of partridges meet with a similar accident. So long as I stand here, the monster will not stir from its lurking place. But we must now decoy it forth." "Will that not be difficult?" "Not at all. Seat yourself yonder on that crag, about 100 yards from the bank, while I retire to a distance. In a short time the reptile will catch sight or scent of you, and perceiving that you are no vril bearer, will come forth to devour you. As soon as it is fairly out of the water, it becomes my prey." "Do you mean to tell me that I am to be decoy to that horrible monster which could engulf me within its jaws in a second? I beg to decline." The child laughed. "Fear nothing," said he, "only sit still." Instead of obeying the command, I made a bound, and was about to take fairly to my heels, when Taee touched me slightly on the shoulder, and fixing his eye steadily on mine, I was rooted to the spot. All power of volition left me. Submissive to the infant's gesture, I followed him to the crag he had indicated, and seated myself there in silence. Most readers have seen something of the effects of electrobiology, whether genuine or spurious. No professor of that doubtful craft had ever been able to influence a thought or a movement of mine, but I was a mere machine at the will of this terrible child. Meanwhile he expanded his wings, soared aloft, and alighted amidst a copse at the brow of a hill at some distance. I was alone, and turning my eyes with an indescribable sensation of horror towards the lake, I kept them fixed on its water, spellbound. It might be 10 or 15 minutes, to me it seemed ages. before the still surface, gleaming under the lamplight, began to be agitated towards the centre. At the same